Hello and welcome to What Lingers, the podcast where we uncover the questions behind people's stories. I am Christian Figueroa.
And I'm Liz Melkor. Together, we're the team behind Storytelling Lisboa, where once a month, 10 storytellers get on stage in front of 200 people and share true personal stories around a theme.
It's always an incredible night, but there is a catch. We always have lingering questions for the storytellers.
In our podcast, What Lingers, we get the answers. In our third season, we jump right in and take you back to that stage. You'll hear the original story told that night.
Then, we sit down with the storyteller for a deeper conversation to explore what lingers for all of us.
Just a quick note, since these recordings are from the actual stage, the audio might be a bit raw.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Good evening. My parents, they were born in the early 50s in southeast Angola, and my grandparents on both sides, they were both very religious, more on my mother's side. So my parents, they took this very common route of teenagers and youngsters in the 60s and early 70s. They attended Mass regularly. They adhered to something called the Theology of Liberation, which was the most progressive wing in the Catholic Church. So progressive that Cardinal Wojtyla, when he became Pope John Paul II, made sure to end it. And eventually they turned communists, and they adhered to one of the many liberation parties in their country. So this was before revolution. Very smartly, the Portuguese dictator had called these maritime provinces after we got backlash from the UN that we had colonies. And eventually, on the 11th of November 1975, this country that my parents had fought for becomes independent. This is when Angola became independent, the 11th of November 1975. And this was the beginning of the dream, yes? They were young, newlywed, had fought for a country that was now free, and as so often happens with such sort of revolutions, a few years after, it all came crumbling down. And in late 1977, my parents were in Portugal. My mother's family is from Madeira, so her parents are from there. That's where they went. My sister was born late December that year, and I would eventually be born in 1984, also in Madeira. And shortly after, 1 year after, on the 25th of May 1985, my mother died. You see, on my mother's side of the family and her father's side of the family, we have a long history of mental health issues. And she died. I was 1, my sister was 7. My father was living in a country that he had known for just a few years at his in-laws. And eventually we came to live in the Lisbon suburbs with my grandmother, my father's mother, and an aunt, one of my mother's sisters, that till this day, whenever I speak of mother, I refer to her. People often go like, she's like your mother. She's not like my mother. If she was my mother, she is my mother. I have 2 mamas. I had them before it was fashionable. So what I was told as a child was that my mother had deep anemia. She had become very, very weak, and she had eventually died. And children believe what grown-ups say, and it was taboo in my house to speak of my mother. Not that anyone ever told us not to. There simply were no photographs. She was never mentioned, and children just do what they see grown-ups doing. They don't do what grown-ups tell them, but they do what grown-ups do. So if no one spoke of her, why would I speak of her? So I just took the story I had been told. When I was about 13, I was in year 8, and my French teacher, his name was Paul, he was a handsome chap, blue eyes, brunette, and we were in a conversation about parents, and he knew my mother had passed away, and he asked how it had been, and I told him I repeated the story I had once been told, and it didn't click. So Mama, my other mother, was in Lisbon at the time. She lives in Madeira, and we were at my godparents in their kitchen. So this was in the mid-90s, beige kitchen. And I asked her, like, how did my mother die? And I was sitting, she started telling a story that seemed really long, to the point it came to a moment I realized I was being prepared to be delivered some huge news. She was clearly very distressed. Her face was somewhat red, and I'm going to guess that by now you've all guessed what I'm going to say. She told me that my mother had committed suicide. She had had a severe postnatal depression. She had had many depressions before, and eventually she took her own life. And she then also told me that apart from me and my sister, everybody knew. Namely, my cousins that were my age or younger. And I remember, for those of you that are here that lived in Portugal in the 1980s, 1990s, which I'm guessing it's not many, it really felt like a Brazilian soap opera. It's like this huge family secret that was kept for, 12 years. And I remember vividly feeling detached for the first days after I was told from this reality. It was like something that happened in a soap opera to someone else. Because it was just so, it seemed so out again of a soap opera. It seemed so out of a novel that a whole family kept from only two people a secret for so long. The problem with secrets is that they need to keep going. And you see, my mother, she had promised my father, when her sister, my other mother, died, that she would never tell us, but if we were to ask, she would also not lie. I had asked, she had told me. My sister never asked. My sister is older than me. She was 7 when our mother passed away, so she vividly remembers my mother. She never asked. She never asked for many, many, many years. And the thing is, one thing is if you ask, and the other is how do you start this conversation with someone that in the meantime has become a grown-up and has never asked anyone, also because it was very difficult for my sister till very recently actually to speak about her mother, how did my mother die? Or let's sit here, let's have a conversation about how her mother passed away. So 20 years fast forward from me being 13 and asking this was Boxing Day 2017, and we had dinner at my godparents here in Lisbon. I was in the car with my sister and my brother-in-law and my nephew. My nephew was 2 or 3 at the time, and she left me at home. And she came to open the door, which I found strange, because she's not that nice. And we were talking about father in the car, and then we left. My brother-in-law was driving, so he stayed in the car and talking. And then she goes like, yeah, but he became a widower at 32, and then in the conditions he did, he was living with his in-laws, and then the wife killing herself. And it was the 26th of December in Lisbon. We were outside, but I froze. It was the first time she ever touched this subject. And I was very scared. And then immediately I decided that I would grant her the kindness 20 years before my mother had granted me, and I would tell her the truth. And in the meantime, she said, if you do tell me, it shan't be a revelation, it's going to be a confirmation. And I told her, yes, it's true. She did kill herself, but our Aunt Isabel always says this, which I really like, which is, regardless of the way it happened, she died from the disease she had. She had a mental disease, and that's what she died from. And I asked my sister if she wanted to know how it had happened, because I had asked my mother and she had told me. She said no. And then, yeah, she went into the car and I went home, and I was pissed off. I was pissed off, especially at my father, that at 33 had to come to me, that I had to tell my older sister that our mother had killed herself. And I made sure my father knew I was pissed off at him. But cliche and very corny as it is, age and time, they do help a lot. And 32 years after it happened, me and my sister, came up with this narrative that we still believe that it was likely for the best that so many years after it happened, it was for me to tell her how our mother passed away. Thank you.
Hello again, and today we are here with Filipe. Thank you so much for taking the invitation to be in What Lingers podcast and share a little bit more of your story. Of course, we know you from the stage at Storytelling Lisboa, but could you please introduce yourself a little bit more for people listening at home around the world?
Hello. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here. Isn't this the hardest of the questions? My name is Filipe. I'm 41, and I was born in Madeira. I've lived in Lisbon since I'm one. I've always lived pretty much divided between both places. I read history in university, and currently I work as a tour guide in Lisbon.
Okay, and this is amazing because, in fact, I actually want to start with a history question, a history of Portugal question, and about your parents, because that's also how you start the story. But I think for listeners at home and for a lot of people, it is really interesting. So your parents were born in Angola. They were part of the revolution in 1975, and then they came back to Portugal, and they came back as part of a mass migration. Am I right? And it was a group of people called the Retornados, and you can say that more correctly. And I'm just wondering if you could situate us a little bit of what that group was, and then also about what Portugal was like in 1975 with its politics, the dictatorship, and all of that.
Let me see if I can be synthetic on this. So, on the 25th of April, 1974, which curiously the majority of the world outside of Portugal knows as the Carnation Revolution, and we in Portugal mostly know as the 25th of April, there's this coup d'etat from the military captains, basically just to end the colonial war. Portugal had been in war with its colonies since 1961, give or take. But they know from the start that to end it, they need to end the regime as well. And that will start a revolution. I'd just like to make this note. One of the most amazing things about this is one of the very, very few revolutions in the world that from the start, the military was ready to give the power back to the people. So in just a few months, not elected because elections will take 1 year, but the prime minister was already a civilian by the summer of that year of 1974. What this will cause is precisely that. So the colonial war will end and the colonies will become independent, but we will have an enormous migration of not only families that had moved from Portuguese provinces or what is now Portugal to the old colonies, but for example, on my father's side of the family, families that had been in these colonies for a few generations and that came back. For example, my father had never been to Portugal before he moved, and his parents were born in Angola as well. So we're going to have millions of people literally coming. They're called retornados. So they came back, but many of them didn't. That was one of the major issues, was the displacement of these people. For example, it happened with my father, but even with my mother, she studied in Lisbon, so she took her degree here in Lisbon. University started opening by the early 1970s in the colonies, but yeah, people would still come to Lisbon to study, when they wanted to get a degree. So there's going to be a mass movement starting in 1975 to the metropolis, so basically to what is now continental Portugal. My parents, however, my family on my mother's side did return in 1975, but my parents decided to stay precisely because they had joined the main party in Angola, and they had fought in the liberation war and all of that. They decided to stay. They wanted to be part of the country that they were building, right? I talk about this in the story. So it's this idea, this ideal they had fought for that finally had come true and that they were going to live it. And then revolutions turn sour very quickly and very easily. And democracy is a fine idea when it's not practiced. So it goes away from democracy very quickly. And Papa and Mama were not happy with it. And according to my father, their home got invaded thrice by the party. And then my mother was expecting my sister, and they decided they didn't want to stay. And that wouldn't be a safe environment to have children. My sister was born in December 1977. So a few months before that, my mother came. And actually, my father only came in the beginning of 1978.
And part of these retornados, and my accent's awful, there was something around 1 million of them. Is that true?
Yes, it's a huge migration. Yeah.
And so that really changed Portugal in many ways. And how was the reception or attitude in continental Portugal towards this new wave of people that were in some ways Portuguese, but many had no, they call them the return. Retornados means to return. But a lot of them, as you said, it was your father had never even stepped foot on this land and that he was returning to.
I don't know if this answer is going to be very risque, but it was very similar to the reception we're giving people that are coming from abroad today. It was very bad. People weren't happy with it. And it was basically the same speech, that they would lose their jobs because of these people, that they would feel they would be more qualified than them, that they were occupying a space that wasn't for them, etc. So nothing has changed much in these past 50 years, unfortunately, in regards to that specific situation. So they're not very welcomed. That creates a huge problem because these people, contrary to the vast majority of the immigration we receive now, which are people that are living their countries in search of a better life, these people were coming to this country because of war. And because in many situations, for obvious reasons, the Portuguese population in some places, I don't want to say was under attack, but it was eventually under dangerous situations back in the previous colonies. So they felt safer to come back. And it wasn't that safe. And you were asking as well about the differences between Portugal and the colonies. So, for example, my parents, when they went back, they felt that it was like going back in time. There was a huge step back. It was socially way more underdeveloped than Angola, and even technologically, but socially was the biggest impact. My aunts and uncles on my mother's side tell a lot about this, that the social divisions were way stronger. It was way more socially divided and strict than back in Angola.
So interesting, because in that sense, nothing has changed indeed. Also, because I mean, I had that feeling when I moved back to Portugal when I first arrived 6 years ago from Brazil. And I'm from Colombia and I spent a few years in Brazil. I did feel like I went back in time, 10 years at least. And I always thought that humanity, we are just going in cycles and cycles. But now, when it comes so clear that indeed we just go around and around in circles socially and other areas. But yeah, I'm just, I'm going to open a different window, a quick one, because while I was listening to your story, I was really impressed by your memory and your dates, because I'm really bad at dates and memories. And was there any influence from your parents' history that make you pursue this degree? Or
I was sure I wanted to have a degree in history since I was 10. And I also remember this vividly.
History nerd. I like it.
I love your question because memory works in many different ways. So, for example, I'm great with remembering names, which, for example, even socially works wonderfully. So I may not be able to see a person for many years, and I will still ask about their children, and I will know the name of their children, all of that. But then, if you tell me something like, tomorrow morning, when you get up, I need you to leave the bathroom window open, I need you to put the cover, I will not remember. It was something that was very difficult for me because Mama would tell me when I was a kid all the time. So this would happen and say, I can't understand how someone that remembers all the dates, all the names, all the kings and queens. Yeah. And I struggled a lot with it because I felt really guilty, but really it's proven that memory works in different ways. But going to your question, yes, of course, looking back, of course it did influence. I had two grandmothers that told me stories since always. And this influenced a lot, a lot. And I was always curious about, I still today, for example, I love fantasy, both on movies and on literature. But the thing is, I'm always curious to know more about those places, those people, that civilization. Like, who are those people? How were the cities like? What was the type of government exactly? I'm a huge Star Wars fan, for example. I'm way more interested in the politics and the civilizations than, well, I like the story, of course, it's fun. I'm way more interested in law than in the stories itself. Or themselves. So yeah, I think it came from that. Make a small note on when you said, Christian, about things going in cycles and in circles. Historians really hate that. It's because history as a science, so history is defined by two main variables, which is time and space. And time and space never coincide again. They never repeat. You never have the same time in the same space. So yeah, we hear a lot that, and well, this is a big internal fight with me because on other areas, namely more holistic areas, I tend to agree. But scientifically, it is true that these two variables never repeat, time and space. So yeah, there is conflict there.
True. And in spirituality, I normally say that we go in spiral because it seems like we're going back to the same thing, but we are actually not ever in the same place or in the same time. But it just feels like we are going back, but actually we're not. So yeah, you're right.
Well, let's use that to actually go back in time and space to you growing up in the 80s and 90s in Portugal before you are 13 and you find out that your mother has, in fact, died. So, in those formative years when the story that has been told is that your mother has died of anemia, and I'm guessing that you probably have very little memory, if at all, of your biological mother.
I have no memory.
And so just tell me what it was like in your household, because you said she wasn't talked about and it was almost like a taboo subject. Like you couldn't ask questions. And which is interesting because you're talking about how curious you are about the world and all of this. So I'm wondering if this was like a tension point for you, or looking back, how did that feel?
That's a complex question. And this is because children's reality is created by what they have around them. And children eventually accept stuff. But yeah, looking back now, I don't think there was tension, but it was odd. There were no photos of my mother in our house. She was never talked about. Well, my grandmother on my father's side, who raised me, so Papa was virtually working all the time. We shared a room until I was 18. And as a child, I saw my father on Sundays, basically. Because he was working all the time, especially on weekdays. When I got up, he was already out, and when I would go to bed, he was still not in. And even sometimes she would talk. I didn't ask many questions because of what I said, I think. So she wasn't part of my reality. She was not there. And there was the sense that, looking back now, there was a sense that you weren't supposed to talk about it. No one did. People didn't ask questions. My father surely never did. So my mother, shortly before she died, she left me a book actually on human reproduction. So these are 1980s boomer parents that they're very scientifically progressive. So they would do this. So just a small note to say, for example, my godmother, who never touches on these subjects, when I was 20 something, she left a book underneath my pillow that was called Born to be Gay, A History of Homosexuality, which I read like this in front of her at her house. And she never asked me about it. So yeah. To make a reference to your culture, Liz, it's a bit WASP culture. You don't talk about it. You just live through it. Yes. And, but she wasn't present. She wasn't there. I missed it. For example, at school, I hated Mother's Day because, well, I would give it to my granny, but still, it's that, like, you're giving it as a substitute. It's not meant for that person. She's not your mother. And I only started calling my mother's sister, whom today I call Mama, only when I was 14, because this was a huge fight. So my father was immensely against it and would make huge scenes when I would say that she was like a mother to me, etc. He would get super jealous and angry and bitter. So yeah, she wasn't very present. It wasn't a taboo. No one ever told me I could ask questions. And I was going to say about the book, on reproduction. I knew the book was mine, but I could never touch it. But no one never told me not to touch it. And one day, it was for schoolwork. I just grabbed the book, and actually there was a full letter written on the front page by my mother. Yes. And I read it, and I started like crying desperately. This was year 6, actually. So I was 12. And father rushed into the room with my sister and kept asking, like, have you read the whole thing? And I said, yes. And he was quite desperate. So looking back today, I think that he was in fear that I might have guessed that she had taken her life. This was like 2-3 months before it happened. So she was very depressed. It's clearly also now looking back. So I was 12 at the time, but also now looking back, that's clearly something written by a really depressed person, already detached from reality.
And just to interrupt, what did the letter say?
Well, it was an apology letter that she had been a terrible mother, that she couldn't take care of me. So this is why I say that it was already something very detached from reality. And this person going down in the spiral, they eventually ended as it did, that she had been a terrible mother, that I deserved everything the best and she couldn't give it to me. Not materially, but emotionally, that she couldn't be present. By this time, my mother, she was in a clinic here in Cascais. Yeah. And this is where she passed away. And I was back in Madeira with my father and with my mother's family. So it was along those lines.
I mean, this was in some ways a first opening because this is before you understood that she had committed suicide. So did this apology letter open your curiosity more, or?
No, it didn't. And it wasn't then that I asked myself what had happened, and it didn't spark any curiosity. But going precisely to the theme of the story I told at this occasion, that was lies. This is what happened when you tell lies this big, is that a 12-year-old kid will get a situation like this and he won't be in the least prepared for it. It was very strong what happened. Imagine what it is reading 11 years later a letter from your mother that you don't remember. And this is the letter. There wasn't anything positive or endearing or about it because it's already a letter from a person who was very sick when they wrote it. But it didn't spark anything. It didn't come from that I would ask what had happened. I think sometimes you just don't want to know. There are things that are right in front of you that you don't want to know. Rationally, irrationally, you make the decision just not to know, not to ask questions, not to be curious. I had never thought about these things up until right now with your questions of this relation of me being a very curious person and wanting to know a lot of details and actually having never cared about the details on the passing of my mother until a very specific moment.
Well, it's interesting if I think more about that because it's like when you use the Star Wars example, you're sort of interested more in the macro and how the world is built and not as much into the characters themselves. And in some ways, as a child, you were having to sort of understand all of these unwritten rules, all of these stories and lack of stories that were being told. You were more trying to understand sort of like the rules around it than being able to directly ask and sit with feelings and all of these because of your family culture.
Yes. Yes. It's not, I gave the wasp example. It's not exactly that. But yes, it is a lot of you should understand certain rules that were not told. So it's pretty hard for children to, I also say on story, and it's true, like children don't necessarily do what adults tell them, but they do what they see adults doing. So yeah, it is important also to tell them stuff, to tell them rules, to tell them like what you expect of them, how you expect them to behave, and not that they deduce it. Deduction is only possible because like you have the information and children are growing up. They're in the part of their lives that you're giving them the information later on they're going to use for deduction. So yeah.
I'm curious, do you know if your sister had a letter too? If your mother wrote her? Because she was older and she probably had more memories about your mother.
My sister does remember my mother. My sister does not call my mama mother, she calls her aunt or by her name. And there's no letter. There's no letter from my sister. So there was, unless there's another family secret that I don't know of. I know there's something written like on the minutes before she left the clinic, before this happened, and that she wrote something on a piece of paper that my grandmother has on the back of a portrait with the last handkerchief she used. And I knew my grandmother asked me if I wanted to read it. And I said no. And she asked me often, and I never wanted to read it. And I don't want to read it. I don't think it represents the person my mother was. I think that when you write something at that stage, Maybe this is a narrative I choose to create, which is the most likely answer, but it's smoothing and it makes things easier and it doesn't hurt anyone. And I do have the choice of reading it or not. So I think it was great from my grandmother that she told me, and that I know this exists, because people do change. I do change mind. I say as on the story that I asked my sister if she wanted to know how it was that our mother passed away, and she said no. And I knew years later that she had asked my mama how it was, and they spoke, and she told her how it was. So at the moment, she didn't want to know, and eventually things change. Those things can change. So I know I have that option, but I really think it doesn't. Anything that you write when you're that in that level of sick, it doesn't represent you as a person.
Yeah, it's pretty fair, actually. And I mean, it's the story that we decide to write and live, right? I'm really curious about because you mentioned a lot about the culture, and I'm wondering if it is like you feel this is Portuguese culture, this is Angolan culture, is a little bit of both. Have you been to Angola?
I've never been to Angola. Father always said that he would go back once he retired, and he did. He went back in 2016. Then the pandemic hit, so he was for a while here. And he went back, he taught at a local university. And then he came back. So he realized it wasn't a place that he would be able to set in his later years. And he was struggling with a lot of things, so he came back. But I've never been. To answer your question directly, I think it's more of Portuguese culture. So even though my aunts and uncles talk a lot about the cultural differences and the way they were brought up, and I said that when they came back, they shared that it had been as going back in time, especially socially. And maybe if my aunts and uncles, my parents would listen, they would hate me, but they are Portuguese. They have a Portuguese cultural background. My parent has Angolan citizenship. He fully identifies. He fought in the independence war. But if we're going to be honest, culturally, that background, of course, influenced by the place where they were, but it's entirely Portuguese. And let's remember that even if they were quite poor, which was the case on my father's side of the family, they were still white in Angola. My father says the first time he remembers racism was when they were playing football on a field, a bunch of guys, and the police came in and started running after them. And my father, he was 7, and he started running away. And until he realized they were not chasing after him, because they were not chasing about any white boys. They were just chasing the other boys. So even though there were many social differences, even in Angola, etc., they were still white. So they do belong to this Portuguese cultural background. And in the specific case of my mother's family, I think it has to do with the cultural background of her mother, in that it is more of a WASP culture, which is just put it behind your back, deal with it in your own way, don't talk about it, because no one has to be worried with your problems and with your weights. You deal with them, and let's just move forward. So we're here, we're a family, we support each other, but we don't annoy each other with our problems and with things that weigh on us. Yeah.
Which a lot of the heritage of Catholicism in these countries. I mean, as you speak, I can totally relate with your story because that was kind of my story. This fact that your parents don't tell you or explain to you why you shouldn't be doing this or that. They just expect you to know, and then they punish you when you don't do the right thing, of course. And then it's, but I'm also wondering, when we share our stories in front of strangers and when we share our stories, we kind of open a new window on a new door to that story. And we make space for change, or we make space for reflection. And I do have the inner belief that as a family members, we, at some point of our lives, we also teach our parents, and we teach them things that they never had. And in my family, for example, I was the first person to kind of defy my dad's system, authoritarian system, of course by being gay, but of course by not just thinking differently and being emotionally available and telling them that I love them. And teaching my mom to express her emotions and to talk about it because she was not able. So I kind of made that move inside my family, at least with my sister and my mother. And nowadays, that's a completely different story from 15 years ago. And I'm wondering if by you sharing these stories and at storytelling and being here talking with us, have changed something inside of you, because from the book that your aunt left you under the pillow about being gay and queer communities and never talk about it. I mean, it seems like there are a lot of things that you never talk with your family. Do you think that's gonna change, or do you think, or if already changed in your family, do you think it's something that you would like to do, would like to pursue?
It has been changing along the years. One of the things I feel the greatest change is when generations change. So from the time when I was a child and a teenager, that last generation of my grandparents, it doesn't exist anymore. They all passed away. And there is now a generation that didn't exist when I was a child, which is the generation below me of my nephews and nieces, both on my sister's side or on my cousin's side. So that also helps, that evolution of time. And going back to what you were sharing about being emotionally available, seeing these differences, to it's something that I feel has been happening. So the first note I'm going to make was when I was 14, I lost my grandfather on my mother's side, and I realized that he had passed away. I idolatrized I shouldn't use this word. He was a Catholic. I really looked up. He was a huge influence, my grandfather. So he would detest that I would use these two words that are just reserved for God. Yeah. And he passed away. I had never said, I love you. So I made sure that I would tell grandmama I loved her. And I did. And it was awkward. It was awkward AF. It was really, I felt it was cringe. I felt odd, but I did it. And from the 13 years before the passing of my grandfather to the passing of my grandmother, I told her often how much I loved her, how important she was for me, and the importance she had in my life. And I'm really happy I did. And she did express it later on, how happy she was that I shared with her how proud I was of her, etc. So going back to the changes you were saying, for example, the only bad coming out story I have is with my father. It was awful. I was 21 when I told him, and he basically said, I was so happy he was the last person in my family I told, because he told me, I don't want anyone to know. And it was like, too late for that. First, I'm pretty obvious. It's not that I'm trying to hide it. I just had never said it to you. And second, yeah, you're just proving it right that you're the last person I'm telling. And it was a taboo for 10 years. And then at 30, he became very accepting. And I was pissed off at him because all of a sudden he just changed this very and I remember telling my sister, what happened?
Wait, hold on. I just want to clarify. So you were mad because he had gone from not accepting you suddenly to accepting you, and it was like that quick change made you mad?
Yes, because we never talked about it. Like, it was 10 years a taboo, and all of a sudden, he on the phone has a conversation with me saying how proud he was in the way I had chosen to live my truth, etc. So you cannot go from point A to point B without a talk.
I get it. It's completely out of your control. There's no sort of conversation and building of it. It's not inside the relationship. It's just separate. And what are you supposed to do? Wait, sit there and wait?
Yes, exactly. The code you prepared me for was that this was a taboo. And all of a sudden, it stopped being a taboo. And you're doing this super accepting P-flag dad speech, which may sound paradoxical, but you need to have a conversation precisely because of what you're saying. You need to prepare that. You can't go from point A to point B when it's something as deep as this without just saying anything. But 2 years fast forward, we were in a huge discussion, me and father. This was in Feira do Livro here in Lisbon, so it was in public, which he hates. And I just recounted a moment we were in his kitchen many years before that he was praising my brother-in-law. And I said, you're always talking about your son-in-law. And he said, it's the only son-in-law I have. And I said, well, for now. And he went berserk. He just said, I will never call a son-in-law of any boyfriend you have. And yes, he went ballistics. And so, when you're in a fight and you don't have any arguments, you just pick up any ammunition you have. And that's why usually very silly arguments go really deep, because you just pick up the strongest stuff you have at hand. He called me. I refused the call. He called me again. Then he texted saying, I really need to talk to you. And he said on it, for this very non-accepting father. So you see, this was likely it should have started like this. He said, I don't remember that conversation at all. But if you're telling me this happened, I believe you, because clearly this was something that really shook you. And I wanted to call you to say that I don't think like that anymore. And I think it's really wrong to think like that. And I would like to apologize really for that, and that being a memory of yours. You can imagine I was walking from Merkerspombal till my home in Avenida de Roma. I was crying all that time.
Yeah.
I am crying already here.
Yes, on this, Christian, I think you can relate a wee bit better, because this is really strong. So, and it's way stronger usually coming from a father to a boy, to a gay man, than from a mother. Contrary, my mother had the most accepting story. So when I told her, she just grabbed my hands and she said, I wanted to have this conversation many times, but you all always ran away. And I thought I should respect you. I know. I think it's really important that you tell me thank you. I was raised to believe that is wrong, that being gay is wrong. And I know that's my prejudice. So we're going to have to do this together. And I think that was so honest, because you also have to understand parents in their own context and in their own time. When I was younger, I was super mad at these things, usually like, no, because it's not about you, it's about us, and it's really difficult for us. And then, yeah, it's also about them. I once had a friend that came out very late in life, and he said, but the thing is, when you come out, which is entirely your decision, you're making your family come out. Your father becomes the family of a queer person. Your mother becomes the mother of a queer person. You're outing them as well, through no choice of their own. And parents don't have the right to weigh their expectations they have on you, but they do have expectations. We all do. So they also need to go through the mourning of the expectations. And sometimes you need to understand that people will give you as much as they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking about taboos and family secrets and lies, how is the relationship nowadays in regards of the your sister, your dad? Have you talked to them? Like, is this something that you talk, the passing of your mother, openly now?
We do. Not with my father, not me and my sister with my father, nor me with my father or my sister with my father, but between us, we do. It has become okay topic. We can talk about it. There isn't that much to discuss. I think we both take it as a fact. It happened. We do discuss it when we have problems about the implications this has brought in our lives, in the way we behave, in our relationships with others, etc. But mostly, what can we do towards it?
What do you think some of the examples are of ways that it has affected you in how you live your daily life?
Me, I'm always on top of people, and having been always very needy, luckily then there's therapy, because there's only so much that you can blame on your childhood, your parents, and the background you had. It comes to a point when you're already grown up that, hey, especially if you're like a middle class grown up, there are many solutions. There are many things you can do than just blaming your background on the way you act. And this is something that was likely the hardest to accept. It's never natural for me. It's always an effort not to be clingy, not to be needy, not to be constantly texting. I feel almost all the time the need for emotional validation. Two things that have helped me is that's my thing, that's my problem. The validation of others, it may help, but it will never fulfill that void I have. It's something I have to deal with it. And then realizing what I said, sometimes what you needed is something that people can't give you. My father was the first person I realized that the validation I've needed all my life from him, that doesn't even exist for him. He doesn't even know what it is. So he can't give it to me because he doesn't have it to give it to me. And I needed to accept that.
Totally. I really feel that like a big part of growing up, and I feel like it's a middle age transition. Maybe also when you start to see your parents get older and you realize, oh, wait, they're fallible, mortal humans.
Yes.
And you get to this point where you're like, oh, wait, like I've always wanted them to be this person and give me this love that I expected in this way that I expected, that I felt like I needed. And I definitely have rage at my parents for not being the parents that I idealized in my head, you know? And then at some point, you just are like, wait, my parents, I believe they did the best that they could. And it wasn't exactly what I needed, but that's okay. I can process
Yes.
the grief of what I didn't get, get out my anger and then like let go of the resentment and be able to have the relationship that I can have as they are.
Yes. What I feel is that late Generation X and especially early millennials who were raised by boomers, like my case, we are always expecting for our parents to validate our adulthood and to treat us as equals, as adults, but we do not treat them as equals. We do expect them to be superhuman beings. We do not expect them to be fallible. We do not expect them to be selfish. We do not expect them to be petty. We always expect them to understand our point of view. So we are constantly asking to be standing at an equal level on the conversation when we are never putting them or almost never putting them on an equal level. Of course, this is way easier said than done. I think I'm only in the theoretics on this one at this moment, but at least I got that.
And that is something that I think takes a lifetime to learn, probably more lifetimes than one. But I think we've come to the end of our chat, unfortunately. So many more questions, but thank you, Filipe, so much for sharing everything with us. And I just have one final question, which is how has it been for you to revisit your story today?
Well, it was great because I got to think of things that this is what happens when you share stories, right? And when you talk about them, that you get to think of things from different perspectives and points of view. The thing I'm taking the most that struck me the most was precisely that how I always been a very curious child, always interested in so much details. And I had never cared to ask anything until I was sitting in a very definitive way or stronger way about what had happened to my mother. And this is a point of view that until an hour ago, I had never had. That's what humanity has always done since the start, right? We tell stories, we create narratives, and sharing them allows us to see the world, the same story, in other perspectives.
That's it for this episode of What Lingers.
If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast. It really helps us reach more listeners. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, we'd love for you to share this episode with them.
What Lingers is a podcast from the team behind Storytelling Lisboa and is produced by both Liz and I and edited by Liz.
We're a small project and your support truly motivates us to keep going.
Would also love to hear from you. Feel free to send us a DM or even a voice note with your thoughts, your comments, or questions to our Instagram at WhatLingersPod.
Don't forget to subscribe and follow us so you never miss what lingers next.
Bye!
Bye!